So this morning's gospel is the story of Bartimaeus, a blind man in Jericho. Jesus heals his eyes, his sight. He's able to see. And it shows to us that God, through the person of Jesus, can do anything. It was 15 seconds. That's better than it was at the 8:30 service. I'm getting better. That's a 15-second sermon, and it is correct. And it is right. And it is short. So I don't ever want to hear you say that sermons are always long and boring. I might be boring, but I only took 15 seconds. And just like our service today, there's more. After the piece, which I call halftime, then we go to the table and we share bread and wine. And then there's more. After that, we are sent out to the world to do God's work in the world, to heal ourselves and to heal others, and to give us a firm understanding of God's love for the world and creation. So while we enjoyed a 15-second sermon, there is more. So I want to ask you this question: is the gospel this morning about seeing or speaking? Seeing or speaking? Because Bartimaeus draws our attention to the fact that he is blind, and we have that interesting allegory between what we can really see physically and what we can really see as far as understanding. Is this about seeing or speaking? I think it's about speaking. Because if you see what Jesus does, Bartimaeus calls out to him. That's a speaking in and of itself. And what happens to Bartimaeus? Shh! Don't make a fuss. Don't make noise. You're too loud. And then Jesus invites Bartimaeus to come to him. Here is a beggar. Here is a blind man. We can imagine that he is dirty, smelly. He may not have had anything to eat. His clothes are all tattered. Clearly, Jesus can see that Bartimaeus is blind. But what does Jesus do? He asks Bartimaeus, "What would you like me to do for you?" At first, that seems kind of odd. Jesus asks the obvious. But if we really dig down, we see that Jesus is giving us an example of how to be respectful of other people. We see someone who is dirty, who has ragged clothes, who probably hasn't eaten, who probably has rotten teeth, unkempt hair. Would we not want to say, "Oh, here, let me help you," and give Bartimaeus something, without stopping to consider what Bartimaeus may have wanted? Yeah? But we feel good because we just helped Bartimaeus. These days, that's called cheap grace, because we feel really good about ourselves, but we haven't addressed the need that the person identifies. That's giving a person dignity, to let them speak for themselves. So that's one lesson that we want to remember. The second, I think, is more in our common experience, at least in my common experience, what it is speaking in the church. Now, Colleen and I are called to preach the gospel, to open the word so that we all can talk about it and think about it. And as we see from our second reading, it's not necessarily the glorious thing. I think this is a riot. The former priests were many in numbers because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. All of those many priests that were created by the law were corruptible, not only in their body, but sometimes, I hate to admit, in their behavior as well. And Jesus is uncorruptible. And that's why he is complete, and he is here forever. So right away, priests get slammed. But some of that is our own doing. The other tricky thing about being a priest and speaking, does a priest preach politics from the pulpit? Now, how many of you stomachs just flipped over? Some of us, priests, are called to be prophetic. And some of us are not called to be prophetic. We're called to be more pastoral. Neither is right or wrong, because if you take the gospel seriously, you're always going to end up in justice issues. On the other hand, if I have an argument with Colleen about politics, how is Colleen going to come to me when she needs pastoral care? Do you see what I mean? It's tricky at best. Speaking for us is dangerous. Job. Where's Job? Job. Okay, Job has a problem because he runs smack into God. And he says the wrong thing, and he says, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. So they get that sorted out, and then Job is blessed. He is blessed with 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, which means a minimum of 2,000, and 1,000 donkeys. What would your living room look like if you had been blessed? Sometimes blessings are overwhelming. It's difficult to speak in church because how many times have you seen, how many times have you been involved in a situation where someone misbehaves? I know that's hard to believe in the church, but it happens. When someone is verbally abusive to another person. Okay, it doesn't happen at All Saints, but it happens in other parishes. Do we say anything? No, not very often. Why not? Because we get chastised. We get pushed back. Everybody gets angry with us. We don't like confrontation. We're Christian. We're supposed to be nice and loving and kind to each other, because Jesus told us to love each other. The same Jesus who rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." And that sounds pretty strong words to me. Get behind me, Satan. Your mind is on worldly things, not on earthly things. Jesus gives us an example of accountability. So all of us, priests or deacons or laity, we are all called to speak when things are not right. And that is very hard for us to do. In my home parish, we had just called a rector. Because there was no rector prior, as senior warden, I was sort of in charge of the church. And one day at coffee hour, the children were literally running through the parish hall, which is maybe a third of the size. People were carrying hot coffee. People had walkers. They were slamming doors. They were running into each other. You couldn't hear the conversation. So at announcement time, as a senior warden, I was going to start the announcements, and I stood up and I simply said, "It's 11:45. Do you know where your children are?" Because they always used to broadcast that in Chicago when I was growing up. We had curfew. And from the other side of the room, our new rector stands up and he says to me, "You may have been in charge of this church before, but you are not in charge now." It took me a long time to get over that. And me being me, of course, it's my fault, I'm a terrible person, I did something wrong. But I did something right because it was a dangerous situation. And having children in church or children in worship, for some reason, is always a problem. Because parents get upset, or people who see children doing something that's dangerous, they get upset, but they don't say anything, which makes them even more upset. So you see what I mean about speaking? There's always more to the gospel than a 15-minute sermon. And sometimes that means being drawn a little bit deeper into the gospel so that we're not left with Christian platitudes and things that we can roll off our tongue so easily but lack substance and meaning. Most importantly, lack the acknowledgement that we have things to work on. And that's okay. There is no judgment here. These are things we need to work on. So the choice, you see, beloved, is really ours. We can choose the 15-second sermon, and sometimes, even as a preacher, that would be fine. But we must not always preach 15-second sermons. At some point, we all need to dig down deeper and see what the gospel is telling us.